Somewhere in the ancient city of Alexandria, there was a building that held the accumulated knowledge of the entire ancient world. 500,000 scrolls, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, literature, history, the intellectual inheritance of every civilization the Greeks had encountered. And then it was gone. The story most people know is simple. It burned. One catastrophic fire, one moment of destruction, one of history's greatest losses reduced to ash overnight. That story is wrong. The real story of what happened to the Library of Alexandria is far more complicated, far more human, and in many ways, far more heartbreaking than a single dramatic fire. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was built. Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC on the Egyptian Mediterranean coast, designed from its inception to be not merely a city, but a statement. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy took control of Egypt and began transforming Alexandria into the intellectual capital of the known world. The library was central to that vision, an institution unlike anything that had previously existed, designed not merely to collect books, but to collect all books. Every scroll that passed through Alexandria's busy harbor was subject to confiscation for copying. Ships docking in the port were searched, their manuscripts taken, copied by scribes, and the copies returned to the owners, while the originals were kept for the library. It was intellectual acquisition on an imperial scale, pursued with a systematic thoroughness that no previous civilization had attempted. The library was part of a larger institution called the Mouseion, a research complex housing scholars from across the Greek-speaking world who were paid salaries, provided with housing and meals, and freed from all other obligations so they could devote themselves entirely to scholarship. It was, in modern terms, the world's first research university. Among the scholars who worked there were some of the greatest minds of the ancient world. Euclid developed his foundational work in geometry there. Eratosthenes, the library's chief librarian, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than shadows, geometry, and the distance between two Egyptian cities. Archimedes studied there. Herophilus conducted anatomical research there that would not be matched for centuries. The library was not simply a repository of existing knowledge, it was a generator of new knowledge on a scale the ancient world had never seen.
The scroll collection at its peak is difficult to estimate with precision. Ancient sources give figures ranging from 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, though scholars treat these numbers cautiously since ancient counting methods and the definition of what constituted a single scroll varied considerably. What is not in doubt is that the collection was extraordinary in its breadth and depth. Works of Greek literature, philosophy, and science, alongside translations of Egyptian, Babylonian, Jewish, and other traditions. It was the most comprehensive accumulation of human knowledge in the ancient world by any reasonable measure. Now, what actually happened to it? This is where the popular story collapses under examination. The single dramatic fire narrative is almost certainly wrong, not because no fire ever touched the library, but because the library's decline was a process spanning several centuries rather than a single catastrophic moment. The event most commonly blamed, Julius Caesar's fire during his military operations in Alexandria in 48 BC, almost certainly damaged warehouses near the harbor containing books awaiting export or processing rather than the main library itself. Ancient sources describing this event mention books stored near the docks, not the library's primary collection. The library appears to have continued functioning after Caesar's involvement in Alexandria, with scholars working there in subsequent decades and centuries. The library's long decline appears to have been driven by a combination of factors operating across several hundred years. Funding was the most persistent problem. The Mouseion and library depended entirely on royal patronage, the enthusiasm and financial commitment of the Ptolemaic rulers who had created them. As the political situation in Egypt grew more complex under Roman influence and eventually Roman control, that patronage became less consistent and less generous. Scholars drifted away to other centers of learning. Acquisition slowed. Maintenance of the existing collection, a constant, labor-intensive, and expensive process of recopying deteriorating scrolls, became increasingly difficult to sustain. There were moments of violence. The Roman Emperor Aurelian's military campaign against Alexandria in the 270s AD damaged significant portions of the city, including the royal quarter where the main library was believed to be located. The reign of Emperor Theophilus in the late 4th century saw the destruction of the Serapeum, a temple complex in Alexandria that housed a secondary collection of books, sometimes called the Daughter Library, an act carried out in the context of broader religious conflicts of the period. Each of these events likely destroyed portions of what remained of the collection.
The Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 AD has also been blamed in some historical traditions for the library's final destruction, a story involving the Caliph Omar and books being used to heat bathhouses. Most modern historians who have examined the primary sources treat this account with considerable skepticism, noting that it appears in sources written centuries after the alleged events, and that the library had almost certainly ceased to function as a significant institution long before the Arab conquest. Attributing the library's destruction to the Arab conquest appears to reflect later political and religious tensions more than historical evidence. What the evidence actually suggests is quieter and more dispiriting than any dramatic fire. The Library of Alexandria most likely died the way most great institutions die, gradually, through declining funding, shifting political priorities, the slow loss of the scholarly community that gave it life, and the accumulated damage of centuries of instability. It was not burned in a night. It faded across generations, each one inheriting slightly less than the one before, until what had been the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world had become a memory that nobody living could quite remember accurately. What was lost is impossible to fully calculate. Works of Greek literature known only by title, plays of Sophocles, histories of events, scientific treatises that existed in the ancient world and exist nowhere today were almost certainly in that collection at some point. What we have of the ancient world's intellectual output is what survived the library's decline through other channels, copies made elsewhere, texts that circulated widely enough to be preserved in multiple locations, works that later Islamic and Byzantine scholars preserved and transmitted forward. It is a substantial inheritance. But the gap between what we have and what once existed in those scrolls is a silence that runs through the entire history of human knowledge. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a night. It was lost across centuries, scroll by scroll, scholar by scholar, funding cut by funding cut, until the greatest library the ancient world ever built existed only as a name attached to an absence. If this gave you a new way of seeing what civilization can build and quietly lose, subscribe, because every week we go looking for the knowledge history forgot to keep.